All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Ivy Felicia, the founder of Fat Women of Color, and this is Friday Fat Chat. Thank you all for showing up. Thank you for watching. If you're watching the replay, thank you for coming over to check out this interview. This is our first recording and live stream to YouTube and Facebook. We're typically on Instagram. We've done about 15 episodes on Instagram. So this is our first time trying out new technology, but this gives us an opportunity to reach out to new faces and more Black and brown women of size. It also gives us a chance to connect with those of you who may not be on, or maybe Facebook or YouTube is more comfortable for you. You still get to be a part of the session and chat with us. So no further ado, Dr. Shemeka Thorpe is our featured guest for today, and I'm so excited to have her coming on with us and to chat with us. Our topic for September was the power of pleasure, and we are continuing with that topic for October because September was really challenging for a lot of us, particularly for Black women as well as brown women of size. And so, we need this extra attention. We need these extra tools, these extra tips, because, I feel like in September we didn't really get a chance. We have different things going on in politically and socially that kind of stole some of that time for us to really focus on our pleasure. So we wanted to continue this theme for all of October. So that's what we'll be doing. And our first guest is Dr. Shemeka Thorpe. So I'm going to go ahead and bring her on the chat.
Hi.
Hi, here we go. Welcome, and thank you for all your patience.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
So first of all, thank you for being here the other day. You are our first guest on the live stream and the simulcast. So we've got all kind of bugs and things like that we're trying out, but you get to be the first. So I appreciate you for being here. And I saw Instagram. That's how I found out about you. And I saw the wonderful work we're doing, especially with the minority sex report. And I know that you specialize in teaching Black women as well as Indigenous women when it comes to sexual health. So I'd love to just give you a moment to introduce yourself, share a little bit about yourself, and then we'll start getting into our conversation.
Sounds good. So hi, everyone. I am Dr. Jamika Thorpe. I am a sexuality educator and researcher. As Ivy mentioned, I am the co-founder of the Minority Sex Report. And the Minority Sex Report is an online platform that was created to provide representation in sexuality education to both Native American and Black women. Growing up in North Carolina, we realized that there wasn't a lot of representation in who our sexuality educators were. And so we really wanted to change that. But also we provide a space for people to blog about their experiences. So we're always looking for guest bloggers, primarily those that are women of color, to talk about their sexual experiences and also just experiences with sexuality education. I'm also a sex researcher, so I work at the University of Kentucky. So definitely September has been an interesting month living in Kentucky with everything that has occurred over the past, months, but also particularly last week. And so as a sex researcher, I focus on the sexual well-being of Black women using an intimate justice and sex positive frameworks. So really focusing on our sexual experiences over our lifespan, primarily adolescence to middle adulthood.
Thank you for sharing. So if we can go back a little bit kind of to your beginning, understanding. Can you tell us a little bit about, growing up as a Black woman? Now, do you consider yourself to be a curvy woman, a plus size woman? How do you identify?
I consider myself to be a plus size woman.
Okay, all right. So growing up, have you always been a plus size woman? And if not, then when did that sort of become part of your identity?
Yeah, I don't. So in high school, I was considered more plus size compared to my peers, but also I was just like an early bloomer. Like I remember wearing like training bras in fifth grade. So I was definitely like an early bloomer in various aspects. I was definitely curvier than my peers. So I was born and raised in the South. I'm from North Carolina. I went to a school that, we had Black students, but it was predominantly white. So definitely compared to the white students, I was curvier than most, and so definitely faced a lot of what I would consider now to be, sexual harassment from guys as a result of that. But definitely, that's something that I've experienced, I guess, from high school and definitely in elementary school. I was, a little bit chunkier than the rest, but yeah.
So with that, your, as I like to say, relationship with your body, and kind of knowing, as a lot of Black women tend to notice, and Black girls earlier in our life, that our bodies are different, especially if you're here or a person of size. Did that have any impact on your self identity or self confidence, like early on in life?
Yeah, I think actually it helped with my self-confidence because I was
Mm,
curvier. Because, with me being an early bloomer, sometimes I got more attention, which sometimes I liked, sometimes I didn't like. I think it helped in that aspect because I was more developed. I also think sometimes it made me have to think about like, am I being considered fast, right? So I had a conversation with someone 2 weeks ago about how like, people always call Black girls fast, and what is a fast Black girl?
mhm.
And so would my body type, let me explore things that, skinnier Black girls could? So if I'm wearing a low cut shirt, am I going to go to the principal's office? Even with skirts, what does that mean? Like definitely I'm going to be in the principal's office. They're going to send me home because Lord forbid if I wear a skirt that shows a little bit of thigh. Now I'm stopping everyone's education all of a sudden. So
Mhm.
definitely, that had some effects, but I think there were more positive things than negative things.
Yeah, I love that you said that, because I think that sometimes for those of us, like I've always said I've been in a larger body since I was younger. So I was like chunky starting at like 5. And for a lot of plus size men, women of size, um, sometimes a lot of times actually it has a negative impact and a lasting negative impact on self-confidence and identity and body image and things like that. And so to hear you say that it was a positive experience for you is really refreshing, because that I've heard a lot of women say. So as you move forward and you got into like your education and your college career, what was it that gave you a passion for sexual health and
Yeah,
for studying sexual health, as well as becoming a professional in the sexual health world?
yeah. So definitely just thinking back to my sex ed experiences in North Carolina. In fifth grade, we had like a puberty class where they split us up. I don't even remember what we watched, but it was terrible. I don't think I learned anything. In ninth grade, our gym teacher, who was a white male, taught us about sex. He was very uncomfortable, turned red in the face. I just remember that we should not have sex and we would get STIs, and no one ever taught us how to put on a condom or anything like that. So
Right.
I actually graduated from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And when I was there, when I graduated, I started working at a nonprofit as a adolescent pregnancy prevention coordinator. And so that's when I became passionate about sexual health work, and just, focusing beyond teen pregnancy prevention, because a lot of times people think sex ed, especially in the South, is only teen pregnancy prevention, and it's not. And just being, with my group of girls, they were 5th through 12th graders. So just hearing their experiences and their questions, I love their questions, that's what really sparked my passion. And then I got exposed to research when I was in undergrad, but I was doing more maternal child research at that time. And so I definitely knew when I got my master's degree and when I got my PhD that I wanted to focus on sexual health research. But when I started reading a lot of the research that was out there, I realized that a lot of it focused on like disease prevention. So like HIV prevention and STI prevention, and just forgetting these other aspects such as like pleasure or intimacy or desire, or now my work is starting to focus more on like sexual pain. And so just missing these like big components of sexuality. And so that right now is what's really fueling me to do the work that I'm doing.
Yeah, man, from everything that you just shared, like all these questions popped up in my head, which is why I love like these really organic conversations, because in thinking about like the things that you said about education, particularly in the early years, adolescent and teens and things like that, and how it's taught to us. And like you said, quite often it is about don't get pregnant, like pregnancy prevention, and that's it. I'd love to know from you, like, what do you think the correlation is, or if you think there's a correlation between teaching sex from a perspective of like don't get pregnant, and instead of teaching it from a pleasure perspective, and how that connects to like what we think about sex as we get older and become women and start to explore our own pleasure as well as partnered pleasure.
Yeah. Well, I think that people can't teach what they don't know. And so we have sexuality educators, well, not even sexuality educators, these were gym teachers in North Carolina, but we do have a great group of sexuality educators. Shout out to everybody that's on the North Carolina Sexual Health Conference planning team. I love y'all. But, we can't, those are the people that need to be hired to come in, because a lot of times we know that older generations in the South didn't receive sex education, let alone learn about pleasure. Like you had sex because it was an obligation or to procreate, or, those were the things that people made it seem like that was the reason why they had sex. And so I think it kind of reinforces this taboo or this stigma, especially in Black communities, about having sex. Like we just don't talk about it. So like, let's just not talk about it. Let's move on. Learn what you're supposed to in school, and then that would be that. And then we have the opposite, right? Like we have some sex positive parents, grandparents, aunts, great aunts, like those people who really, reinforce that. I think in high school is when you're really taught sexuality education. If you have the opportunity to go to college, of course, sometimes there's workshops, but it's like, who is really teaching adolescents and women about pleasure outside of like social media at this point, right? And thank God for that. There's great things on social media. But I didn't have that growing up. Like I think I got Facebook my freshman year of college. So, like those are things that we had back then. And so I think really understanding that a lot of professional development needs to go into so that people can learn more about pleasure and be able to teach it. But also I think pleasure is a fear. Like oh, this taboo thing of pleasure, I don't know how to talk about it, or I don't want to talk about it. And it shouldn't be that way, because we know one of the main reasons that people have sex is for pleasure. Like research shows that. So let's talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're just tuning in, this is Friday Fat Chat, and our featured guest is Dr. Shemeka Thorpe, and we're talking about the power of pleasure. We started talking about the power of pleasure in September and continuing through October, because we need and deserve this extra attention right now. about pleasure, and not only just how we can access pleasure, but also sometimes the things that could be hindrances. And I think this conversation that we're having right now about our beginning concepts of pleasure and sex and things like that, those are really ways to start unpacking, like maybe some of the things that are barriers to us tapping into pleasure. So if you have any questions, you drop those in the chat. We'll be able to pull from those questions later on. Whether you are on Facebook or YouTube, we can see your chat. So we'll be able to pull up those questions and comments, any kind of feedback, any thoughts, anything that's resonating with you. Go ahead and drop that in the chat as well. So, Dr. Shemeka, you gave like so much good information, especially with the perspective of generational thoughts, right, on sex, and especially if you are a Black woman coming from a generation of enslaved people. First of all, our bodies didn't even belong to us. So even the concept of pleasure, like you mentioned, was so far removed from our ancestors, our mothers and our grandmothers and things like that. So they didn't even have it to give to us. Have you seen in teaching around sexual health and pleasure, have you seen how those things have impacted adolescents, teens, college age, and even grown women?
I think more grown women than not necessarily with adolescents.
Okay.
So I think more with grown women, I see that because they have the opportunity to learn more about their history. I think, if people aren't necessarily speaking about it, then, it gives them the opportunity to learn more about it. And I remember teaching an undergraduate course in human sexuality, and in our textbook, it was talking about the pioneers of sexuality education, and it was just a list of all these white people. And so then I went in and started adding other people because I'm not going to sit here and teach my class just about white men and women, and even including enslaved women into that, and naming that and realizing they were, the mothers of modern gynecology. Things were done to them that without anesthesia, and these things need to be taught to people. And so I think that does have an effect, and I think we're seeing more of that medical trauma pop up in TV shows now and even in books. So Lovecraft Country, I love that show. But if they popped up in Lovecraft Country, so Lucy, Betsy, and Anarcha popped up in episode 3. Also, there's more books written about it now. Medical Bondage is one of those books that I've read. It's heavy. It's very emotionally taxing. But I think in order for me to do the research that I'm doing, I have to read those things. So, yeah.
Do you think that, I know you said some of this reading for you is for, of course, your research and your profession. Do you think that it's beneficial for us as laypersons, who are not, professionals, or who want to sort of, get past some of those barriers or tap into more liberty and freedom when it comes to our pleasure? Do you think that reading is beneficial for us as well?
Oh, definitely. I definitely do. On my Instagram page, I actually have 2 reading lists. And so those reading lists contain books about Black sexuality, Black feminism, and pleasure. So I highly recommend those books that are on the reading list. One book that I'm currently reading now, because I always have books handy, is Pussy Prayer. So I love this book.
Nice.
There's a lot of affirmations in it. And so I made a post with some of those affirmations, but I would encourage you all to buy it. It's by Black Girl Bliss. And I think y'all are doing a giveaway for the second book. So that's a book that I would recommend.
Yeah, Black Girl Bliss, Pussy Press is awesome. They have their new book coming out, and they just did a giveaway well, they ended the giveaway yesterday. But the next one is Please, which focuses on pleasure. So that's an awesome book as well. In talking about moving past when we talk about sexual health and sexual education and not just talking about don't get pregnant. It seems to me that the second thing that people would focus most on, and not that this is that this shouldn't be focused on, because we'll definitely talk about this as well. But it seems like it's don't in like STD prevention. But as you mentioned earlier, we don't really have a lot of information about just like how to enjoy sex, and how to tap into pleasure. Are those some things that you also talk about in your work, and in it's that you do, kind of like the differences? I know I've seen some of your work talking about it's not just pregnancy prevention, like it's actually about sex positivity.
Yeah, I think we do get into some of that work. Recently, this was last weekend, I had the opportunity to co-host an event with Kentucky's Ampersand, which is a nonprofit organization for sexual assault survivors. And in that space, we had a retreat called Still I Rise Retreat, which was led by my mentor, Dr. Candace Hargons. And that was just a beautiful space to be in. And in that space, we talked about like, what does it mean to reclaim pleasure, and barriers to it. And, some of those barriers, just like, focusing, one might even just be in getting a mirror to see, to understand your genitalia, learn more about it, learn more about your vulva, learn, more about your vagina, things like that. So that might be a space where I would tell people to start. Another thing we did was build like a toolkit. So what would you put in your pleasure toolkit? Would it be music? Does that get you in the mood? And not just in the mood for partnered sex, but this could also be for solo sex too. Masturbation. So like, what gets you in the mood for that? Is it scent? So for me, like it might be candles because I like candles, or is it certain fabrics? So some people mention like fuzzy fabrics or fleece and things like that, and satin. And so just thinking about really what does that mean, and what are some things that you might want to try. Afrosexology has great worksheets around, and great posts and just journal prompts around pleasure, and just thinking more about the pleasure you would like to receive. But I think the most important thing is realizing that pleasure doesn't always equate orgasms, right? Like you can have pleasurable sex without orgasms. And so once we remove that piece, I think that helps with some of that.
Yes, I'm so glad that you shared that and you talked about that, because when we were with Dr. Uchenna Osai, that's one of the things that she mentioned, and talking about the some of the guilt and shame that people can have with what if they cannot achieve orgasm. And then we also talked about how like there's an assumption that sex is always intercourse, and that there's so many other ways to like have sex and experience pleasure as so. I'm really glad that you talked about that and reinforced that and confirmed that as well. What do you think are some of the ways that we can move from when we're talking about sexual education, whether it be for ourselves, whether it be for, our friends, our family, the generations coming behind us? How can we move from just, when we talk about sexual education, just pregnancy prevention, and move into sex positivity? And can you also a little bit about what is the difference between the two?
Yeah, so sex positivity focuses on the person as a whole and not just pregnancy prevention. It focuses, like we already mentioned, on pleasure. It focuses on sexual identity, gender identity, sexual orientation, which we know in a lot of states people aren't allowed to even discuss. Like it's illegal or banned to discuss these things in sexuality education programs. It also focuses on, sexualization sometimes. It may focus on what do you want out of pleasure? out of sex, and what sex looks like for you. And so just moving from that framework, or moving from, a deficit framework to more sex positive is helpful. But I think sexuality educators do a great job of doing that. And so I think on a state level, it's important for us to hire sexuality educators to actually lead and do these programs, versus having gym teachers that may do it, or providing them with the tools that they need to be effective. I think on an individual level, it would be helpful to kind of have these conversations with family members. Like I can say, since I've been a sexuality educator, I do have more conversations about, sex and pleasure and intimacy and desire and relationships with my family, especially my aunts and my mom. And so that's been something that I've seen that's changed. And sometimes you have to be the person to create that change. For teens and parents, there are some programs that I know are offered at nonprofits in North Carolina, and some other places that really focus on, building these relationships to have a safe person for a teen to talk to. And so parents might not always have the resources, and they might need to learn more. So there are other curriculums. There's also sex positive families. Sex positive families is an awesome resource for anyone that has children. From 0 to 25 and up, just start these conversations early. And what does that look like to talk to a 2-year-old, about sexuality, or versus a 8th grader. So that's a very great resource that I encourage everyone to check out. And they host webinars, so it is accessible, and they have social media accounts.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. For those of you who are watching, this is Friday Fat Chat, and I'm Ivy Felicia, the founder of Fat Women of Color, and our theme for the month is pleasure. The power of pleasure, and our featured guest is Dr. Shemeka Thorpe, and we're sort of talking about the differences between just sort of approaching sex education from don't get pregnant to to really understanding, knowing the body, connecting with the body, and actually teaching about pleasure as well. I know you mentioned Dr. Jamika earlier that, your gym teacher was your first introduction in school when it came to sex education. And like you just mentioned, now, oftentimes in schools, they don't have a budget for a specific sex educator, or they have the budget, but they may not allocate the budget for a specific sex educator. So I'd love to know, and looking at the work that you do with Black and Brown women, what do you think is the importance of seeing Black and Brown sex educators, especially as Black and Brown women? Because I know in social media and a lot of times online, Black and Brown people are already marginalized, but when it comes to sexology and sexologists and sex experts and things like that, it seems like that's the same. You don't really get the recognition. You don't see a lot of Black and Brown sexologists and sex experts. You have to really go looking for them intentionally in order to even know who they are. And it's really important that we see these different people and that we know them. So how do you think that, again, the people that you've worked with and even grown women, and seeing people that look like them teaching these different, whether it be courses or just education around sexual health and sexual pleasure?
Yeah, I think representation matters. I always talk about that. Representation is important because you need to see yourself to know where you can go. And, having these conversations definitely, and seeing Black and Brown women as sexuality educators is important, because then it kind of removes some of that taboo, especially in Black communities where we could talk about, you have a space where you could talk about your sexual experiences freely, or with someone that looks like you. You can have a sexuality educator that is a white woman, but she hasn't had the same lived experiences that I have. And so it may be more comfortable, you know, for adolescents and even women to open up and have these spaces. And, you know, even in the retreat last week, you know, women were saying like, this is the first time I've been surrounded in community with like only Black women. Like it was a Black women led retreat for Black women, you know? And so it's
Yeah.
definitely important because it creates a safe space for Black women to have these conversations, to realize that pleasure isn't taboo, to realize that sex
Yeah.
isn't taboo. And, you know, just to talk about, you know, our lived experiences. And so that's really important. There's a website and an organization called the Women of Color Sexual Health Network, excuse me. And if you go on that website, you can find a list of sexuality educators, therapists, counselors, sexuality professionals. And so that's really a place where I would encourage people to look as well. I even think about sometimes how we are marginalized in sex research as researchers. So recently I was in a group and there was a post asking people to list off their favorite sexuality researchers. And 95% of the people that were listed were white. And so what does that mean for Black sex researchers who have been doing this work for forever, whose work isn't considered fundable by funding agents because it doesn't focus on HIV prevention solely or STI prevention. And so, you know, really we're marginalized in all aspects of that, but we've been out here doing the work for decades.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yes, the representation matters. And again, like just in the intentional work that I've done for my own life, like I know that I had to go looking for Black women, brown women, Black people who are sexologists and sex educators because it's like it's not showing up in the feed as much, or it's not, you know, getting as much hype and attention, or you assume that, oh, they, like you said, you wouldn't think that they exist because all are it seems to be predominantly men that dominate what we see in our feeds. And so in, like, you know, doing the research for myself, because I wanted to find more Black women, I wanted to find more Black people who are counselors, you know, sexologists, sex therapists, like that, who come from my lived experience,
Right.
and who understand like the intersections that I live at. And then in researching this for the Fat Women of Color community and doing even deeper research, it's like once I found a few, I think someone put out a list earlier this year around, it was like 100 Black sexologists or something like that, and it was like a gold mine. I was like, yes. Because once you find one, then like everybody's following everyone else, and then you can kind of like connect and find that community. But you definitely have to be intentional because it's not just readily out there.
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, it's like, you know, we're hidden gems. And so when they created that list, I was like, oh, this is a great list. And then you go in the comments and they're like, and there's more, and there's more, and there's more. So it just kept going and going. But definitely, like I said, we've been here doing the work. And we know that this doesn't even just happen in the sexuality field. This happens in a lot of fields where like Black women in particular are doing the work, but we're not recognized. And so we are the ones that are on the grounds in our communities doing this work, and we should be recognized for that.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I feel like it's just made a difference in my life, and it influenced part of wanting to do this theme for Women of Color for September, and to continue it in October, because just trying to amplify and get it out there, like these people are out here, like people who look like, I think, you know, even if you know some Black sexologists, you might not know you know, Black women of size or brown women of size who are doing this work, you know, especially curvy bodies, size bodies. First of all, they already assume that we're not sexual, or that we, you know, we're not desirable. So then it's definitely more rare to even see or know that there are actually Black and brown women of size out here teach about sex and
Mhm.
about pleasure and leading the charge. So I think
Mhm.
that that can have a really positive and powerful impact on our community to see that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like even just beyond, like leading classes too. So I know you're gonna have Goody on later this month or next month. And so like,
Yeah.
she's a great example of that. Like, we're out here and we've been doing it. So just give us the recognition we deserve.
Yeah, one of the things that we've talked about in our community is, and we talk about in our membership community all the time, is like, like who's your favorite, woman of size, Black or brown woman of size that you saw growing up, and what were the images, and especially for those of us that are like 80s, 90s, early 2000s, we didn't really have a lot of those people on television, and especially since there wasn't a lot of, now um, younger people have a lot more access to like social media, but we didn't have that. So we basically had television, movies, sometimes music videos, but there were so many tropes for
Yeah.
Black and brown women of size, just general. And then to kind of think about sexuality and desirability, that was even more rare. Like to think of, did you see somebody? Did you see anyone? Do you have a fave?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about as you were saying that. I was like, no, they were definitely more like mammy tropes that I saw on TV, especially with women of size. It's like, you're the caretaker, this is just what you do. Um, hmm. The only person that I could think of, I've always loved like Jill Scott. And so to me, like her songs
Yeah.
always, she has songs that are focused on pleasure and desire and intimacy and orgasms and everything in between. So she's someone
Yep.
that I've always loved. I've always loved her. I think that's the first time I felt like I saw myself in someone.
Mm,
Was when I saw her. But other than that, no, like not necessarily.
yeah. And thinking about that, I think that there were the mammy tropes, and then there's also sort of the fat Black and brown women who are like chasing someone,
Mhm.
like the Miss Piggy trope. I'll just call it
Mhm.
that. But but who was like always chasing after like
Yeah.
their person that they want. Um,
Mhm.
and you kind of see that, and that kind of became a stereotype, like, oh, curvy girls or big girls are easy,
Mhm.
because they'll just give it to you because they don't have any self-esteem or they don't have confidence. And so a lot of those assumptions were kind of perpetuated by media, or it's just like, plus size women are a joke, so why would you ever see them as sensual and sexy and sexually powerful? That definitely was not portrayed
Right.
in the media that we had.
Yeah.
Um, I'm sorry, I thought you were saying this. So I wanted to talk over top of you. Um, I know one of the people that came up for us in our conversation, the closest person I brought up was Queen Latifah, and that's because when she was on Living Single, she was the boss.
Yep.
And she always had like, conventionally attractive mates, and
Mhm.
she she wasn't chasing them. Like they were definitely into her. She dated different people. She wasn't like stuck on one guy.
Mhm.
She was an entrepreneur. So I think that was like the first TV person that I saw that was like close to being an example of being like sexy or desirable, or just like, mature when it came
Mhm.
to her sexuality as a Black curvy woman.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah, definitely living single. Oh, a scooter? Oh yeah.
That was my example. That was definitely my go-to example, like scooter. But yes, but I think even that show alone was an awesome example. Black women, claiming sexuality, desirability, all of that with all the different um, characters on the show. We got to see Black women kind of being portrayed in a more powerful position when it came to dating and things like that.
Yeah, definitely.
I know you specialize in sexual health when it comes to sexual education in the South. What is the difference? I'm very curious because I'm from the North. I live in the South. I lived in Atlanta for 7 years.
Okay.
But I love to know, what is the specialization around sex education in the South?
Yeah. So in the South, primarily we are abstinence based or abstinence stressed. I know that's not necessarily the case in the North, in some states, and it's not the case in like California. But in the South, it's definitely abstinence based or abstinence stressed. There's more restrictions on things that we can talk about. So we can't, in some states, you can't talk about sexual orientation. You can't do condom demonstrations. And some of these things can vary by district too, like county. So these are some of the things that are more restrictive. I think part of that is because the South has a large Black population. And honestly, it's just like, let's just prevent pregnancies. And, y'all have high rates of HIV and STIs. Let's just prevent that. Like, y'all don't need to know about pleasure. You don't need to know about intimacy. Like, it's not almost like we're not deserving of that. And so I think that's where a lot of that comes from. We do have the highest rates of HIV, in the South. Is in the South. And so, yes, this is something that we should focus on, but these are other aspects that we can include as well. But just from talking from people that are from the North or that are from, California, I know that some of them had condom demonstrations. They weren't shown like the worst case scenario pictures for sexually transmitted infections that we see in textbooks. So it's less like fear tactics and more like, I want you to be able to make an informed decision for yourself. Here's everything you need to know about sexual health and sexuality. And I don't think we receive that.
Yes, thank you. Kind of bringing some clarity and some understanding to that. So, how do you think that impacts dual, like Black and brown women, since a difference in the education? Do you think that impacts behavior?
You were going in and out a little bit on the last part. Does it impact behavior and what? Can you hear me?
Okay, I think I had a glitch. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yeah, I can.
Okay, all right. I apologize for that. No, I was asking, because there's a difference in the education and also some like limitations on the education and information that's going out in the South. Do you think that correlates to a difference in the behaviors and the perspectives around sex for Black and brown women in the South?
Behaviors maybe, because you don't necessarily like know what you like because no one's taught you these things or you've had these discussions. I mean, even like where to go get condoms, no one tells people where to get them from. Like where would you go to get condoms? I grew up in a rural city, Wendell, North Carolina, a rural town. And we didn't have condoms. Like we didn't have a clinic. We had in high school, we had people definitely that were pregnant, but no one talked about like access to contraceptives or anything, and people had to drive 30 minutes away to get any type of medical care at the time. So that was an issue. I think, I think some of the conversations start within our community more than they do at school. And so I think, yeah, it probably has an effect on behavior, maybe sexuality, but I think it's more society that has an effect on that, and our communities and the conversations that we've had, than it is the sexuality education that we do or do not have. Just because it's only a week. Like our sex ed in North Carolina is a week. I don't know how long it is in other states. So it's not like, it has this long lasting impact because we don't learn anything. Now, if we did learn more about pleasure, I think we would have, or just about, desire, intimacy, contraceptives, where to go to get things, access to care, then yes, we'll be able to make more informed decisions for ourselves as we decide to have sexual intercourse. And we would know how to communicate with our partners and know how to, recognize when we're ready to have sex, and, just how to advocate for yourself in sexual experiences. So I think it would have an effect in that way. Yeah, we would learn more communication skills than we are set up to in, adolescence.
Yeah, communication is so important, and I know you have more to share on that as well. But I feel like when you're only operating from the space of, like we've talked about, don't get pregnant, then it might be like, okay, well, let me do, especially if you're a woman, a vagina owner, you're operating from the space of like, let me just handle my thing, but because you're afraid or intimidated about talking about sex, or from being in a position of power, you might not ask your partner, questions, or you might not advocate for yourself, or, move from a space of agency around your body. And I think that sometimes that can put us in a position of being more passive, because we don't feel empowered. And a lot of times, if you don't have education, you don't feel empowered, so therefore you don't advocate yourself. Yeah.
And I think part of that goes into not knowing how to make condoms pleasurable. Like there's a lot of work about how to eroticize condom use. And so, what does that look like? So, obviously using lube, or putting, sometimes people put lube inside of condoms. But it just varies. Like people don't know how to make sex with condoms pleasurable. And even if sometimes there's not power imbalances and women choose not to use condoms, like that's just, their agency and what they're choosing to do. They just don't want to. And so, just making sure that people also realize, like, all the time, it's not because they don't have the space they're not in the relationship that they can say, hey, I want to use the condom, but like sometimes they're opting to not do it too.
Yeah, that's really good information to have. I'd also, in talking about this, I think that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you kind of talked about like in the South and like the difference on the perspectives around teaching sex like that. And I know growing up for me and a lot of the women and friends that I've had, it was sort of like, for parents, like, oh, well, if we teach them about sex, they'll be more likely to have sex. And it seems like that has to be one of the biggest myths, especially like around pleasure. Like if we just teach it from a prevention perspective, then, that'll just stop them. But if we teach it from a pleasure perspective, then they'll be curious and intrigued and like want to do it more. I'd love to hear on that.
Yeah, definitely. I've heard that over my lifetime. Like if you teach them about sex, they're going to have sex. If you put your teenager on birth control, they're going to have sex. Like I've heard all of those things. But I think teaching adolescents about pleasure allows them to know that like some of these feelings that they're having are normal, and like pleasure is normal, and like we should receive pleasure. And when someone decides to have sex for the first time, a lot of times we get questions like, should the first time you have sex hurt? And I've heard that from a lot of students. And it's because no one has taught them about pleasure or what to do to increase their pleasure, or, just like, no, it shouldn't, because they're telling them not to have sex. So when they have sex, that is painful, then what? Like no one's teaching them that like maybe you should use lube, or like you're probably watching porn, both of you. So like realizing that pornography sometimes isn't realistic, and this is not a realistic expectation for real life, and not shaming that and using that as a teaching tool. And I know, sex positive families, they talk a lot about that. But yeah, I mean, definitely, I think we do a disservice when we don't teach teens about pleasure and about desire, and that these are things that they can do for themselves, especially women. Like, you don't have to rely on someone else. And I think that's an important message to drill home. Like, you can do this for yourself. You can please yourself. And so that's something that I think we really neglect to tell adolescents about.
Yeah, it's I noticed that even in a lot of conversation around like sex and pleasure, that like a conversation doesn't come up about the difference between like self pleasure and partnered sex. Like, people think that sex only starts when you have another human being there with you. And there's also teachings around like you didn't have pleasure by yourself, or you shouldn't pleasure yourself. And so that takes away the power and agency as well. Do you have any insight on that or perspectives on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of times people aren't taught that like masturbation is okay. I was on another podcast and we were talking about masturbation within partner like relationships, and like, should you masturbate? And so many of them had heard that you shouldn't. And I'm like, okay, but what if your partner is tired today and doesn't want to have sex? Like, I'm gonna need you to go masturbate. So like,
Yeah.
like those are some, like, you need to know that you can do that for yourself, and that's not solely on your partner to always do. And so, I think there's a taboo around that. Like, in relationships, what does that look like? I think people definitely are taught that you shouldn't masturbate, or it's like a sin, or it's inhuman, and inhumane, excuse me, so you shouldn't do it. And I mean, that's just not the case, like we see. Even I used to work at a daycare early on, and we were talking about this in another group about, like how even you'll see kids like touching themselves because they're exploring their bodies, not, they're just curious just to see what's there. And we had kids that would do that all the time. And, they were like 4-year-olds. And so you have to realize that these things are natural, and that's okay to do. It's okay to masturbate when you're in relationship, not in relationship, or just to explore. And that's, that could also be like exploring toys too. So that can be an option that people can use if they're interested.
Yeah, I think a lot of that shame around sex also takes away the communication, and it hinders us from getting like the support that we need, whether it be talking to other people. This can be grown ass women, like, because things can be going on and you won't talk to other people because there's so much shame around, whether it be sex or just our bodies, our sexual, our reproductive organs, of those things, because it's just shame. Like, shame can be so complex, and how it hinders our ability to thrive, especially when it comes to sex. If you are watching, this is Friday Fat Chat. If you're watching live, thank you for joining us. If you have any questions or feedback or comments, you can feel free to drop that in the comments box and in the chat, and we can see that. If you're watching replay, you can still drop in the comments, and we'll come back and see that, and I'll make sure that Jamika gets to see that as well. Before we close out, I definitely wanted to, I know this is your specialty, which is the connection between research and sexual health. I'd love to know why research is so important to you. I know you created the Minority Sex Report, and that's part of the work that you do as well.
Yeah, I think, research to really inform practice, right? Like, we shouldn't just be doing research to publish articles that, no one in the community will actually read. Like, it needs to be us doing research to then inform workshops for Black women. It should be us doing research to inform policies around sexuality education. Research exists for a reason. And so I think it helps with best practices, even for medical professionals, with the work I'm doing around sexual pain and how they dismiss Black women's sexual pain. Just Black women sharing their stories in research, but are, medical providers actually looking at that and what can we do to improve that? So I think research has the opportunity to inform what we do on the ground. And I think that's very important. However, we have to figure out ways to disseminate it in different ways beyond just articles. And so that's why it's helpful to, have these chats or to be on, podcasts or to do workshops or, even writing policy papers sometimes helps with that because it definitely informs what we have access to and the future experiences and sexuality education opportunities for, Black and brown women of color, especially in rural areas. I'm always going to drill that home because that's where I'm from. But, it definitely helps with that. And I think the Minority Sex Report is a really good opportunity for us to share our research on that platform to inform and help, Black and brown adolescents. We really focus on Black and Native American adolescents, but really trying to take what we know from research and put it into practice. And so, again, that was co-founded by myself and Gabrielle Evans, who resides in Houston. And so we are doing a lot of work nationwide to just provide that representation, but also to provide sex-positive sex education.
Yeah, and I noticed that the Minority Sex Report censors Black women and Native American women. What is it that made you all choose to censor those populations?
Yeah, I think we focused on what our identities were, so like I'm Black. Gabrielle identifies as Native American, so she's from the Hollowasaponi tribe in North Carolina. Okay. And so, just really centering who we are as individuals. We've had other people talk to us about sex that weren't our identities, didn't match our identities, and we don't want to do the same thing for people, for other people. So we definitely want to make sure we're providing that representation.
Yes, I love that because you all are giving back to your own communities, and you're like the saying goes, be who you needed when you were growing up, and kind of creating that experience for other people in your communities as well. Is that Gabby? She's in the chat. Okay, welcome. I love the work that you all are doing for the community and for your people. And again, that representation matters. So, those of you who are watching, whether it be on a replay, whether you're watching live, I definitely encourage you to put in, if you haven't already done so, definitely put in a bit of extra time and go, research Black and brown sexologists, sex educators, sexual health providers, sexual experts, because like Dr. Shemeka was saying, they're out there, they're doing the work, and they need to be seen and heard, and we need to amplify their voices. And so the next time that question comes up in someone's class, you can riddle off, 10 to 12 Black and brown women or 10 to 12 Black and brown people who are doing this work, and we can start to uplift our own communities. So, Dr. Jamika, I really appreciate you for being here. You disseminated so much information. This is a really good episode. I can't wait to go back and watch myself. I'd love to know if there's anything that you have coming up you'd like to share with us, whether it be you or through the Minority Sex Report.
Yeah, we will have a couple of workshops coming up towards the end of the year, so be on the lookout for those. Nothing right now, primarily for myself. But yeah, the Minority Sex Report will definitely have some workshops coming up before the year is over with. So be sure to follow us on Instagram and on Facebook at the Minority Sex Report, We're also on Twitter at the Sex Report, and I am on Instagram as Dr. Shemeka. Also, I wanted to plug too that there's a resource list that I had created with Black, Indigenous, and people of color pelvic floor therapists, because I was finding a lot of white pelvic floor therapists, and I found that a lot of Black women didn't know what pelvic floor therapy was. So I'm grateful for you having pelvic floor therapists on Fat Women of Color, but just having that also as a resource where they can go on my page and see that full list, and it lives under the resource highlights on my Instagram page.
Okay, so yeah, definitely go visit Dr. Shemeka's Instagram. Check out the information, share it with other people so that people know that there are resources out there. You also have a couple of other resource lists as well. I think I've seen them on your Instagram of other brown practitioners, right? Or Black practitioners.
Yeah, it's just for the pelvic floor therapist. I just have pelvic floor therapists and then the 2 reading lists. So definitely, I love to read. So definitely, there's like 30 books up there about that you can read focused on Black sexuality, sexual pleasure, and Black feminism.
Yes, that's what I was thinking of. I was like, I know I've seen other lists on your page. It's the book list. Okay, so you all, there are awesome book lists on there if you want to read more literature. We just started a book club, the Fat Women of Color Collective, which is our private membership community. So we will be going to that list to find books that we can read, we can explore. We're starting a new book in November. I don't want to give it away yet because the person who's hosting the group, I don't want to mess up her groove. But we are going to do a book that centers Black and brown women's pleasure. So interested in joining us, you can come check out the Fat Women of Color membership community, which is called the Fat Women of Color Collective. And if you're watching the replay, that will be in the show notes. If not, then you can visit our Instagram page or go to fatwomanofcolor.com and get all the information there as well. Again, Dr. Shemeka, thank you so much for being here. Any closing remarks or comments before we close out?
No, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to be up here, and this space is really needed, and I just appreciate you reaching out to me. I had a great time.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for watching, and thank you for participating. Everybody have a great day.